Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today. For everybody in Australia and for the first time in New Zealand, I'm Ricky Himman, the Program Director for the South African Film Festival, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to my special guest. If you would like to introduce yourself to our audiences, please.
Hi, yes, thank you, Ricky. I'm Renee van Rooyen, and I'm the director and screenwriter of Toorbos, which is screening at the festival.
Thank you for joining us today, Renee. Toorbos is such a passionately mastered and proudly South African film, and it really deserves all the accolades that it's received in the past year, especially that it was nominated for South Africa's official entry into the Academy Awards this year. What attracted you to this poignant story in the beginning?
Yeah, and as you know, it being a period film, I started with the story in 2012 when I read it the very first time. I think there's various aspects that attracts you to a story. I think Dalene Matthee, and later on, different things came to it. But firstly, I read Dalene Matthee novel, knowing it has great visual landscape. She's extremely thematic, and it's multidimensional in her approach. She takes simplistic love stories, but she has bigger themes interwoven with it. So I knew it's very good novels to adapt. But I was married in that year. I think I was 27 years old. I hadn't made a feature film yet, and I read this book, and I thought I could relate with this character. It was different to Dalene's other novels. It was very psychological in a way. It was of a young woman trying to find her identity in a marriage. And how love, you take your roots, your love takes different routes, and in the way that you find one another. It's not a simplistic love story. It was very complicated and different in its approach. And I quite like the stubborn-minded protagonist. So I could relate with this character, and I was just married, and I thought, yes, that's a very interesting take on married life, and I felt at that time I could identify with this character who's trying to find her identity and getting lost in it, and figuring out how to be herself and standing up for her beliefs. As a 20-year-old, which I've experienced, it's very relevant to many young women, is how often they would either give up their own voice or their beliefs and identity when falling in love or starting a new career, which was very honest and truthful for me in what Dalene had captured.
Yeah, so what you were actually saying, because when you first approached it, obviously you first wrote the book or read the book. I mean, did you look at it when you read the book out of the sort of the view from adapting this novel, Dalene Matthee's novel, into film through the lens of a filmmaker? Or were you actually then, at the time when you first approached it, were you just thinking, obviously you were saying you can really just relate to the story, or was there a little bit of both in it at the time?
Yeah, definitely both. I remember my closing thoughts when I read the last pages of the book. I remember just it really spoke to me on so many levels. But what was very interesting for me was the fact that the themes of the story, those of uprootment, how it was interwoven with the very simplistic love story and Carolina's story. And I just knew that something like that, feature films take such a long time. It took 8 years. It's now 9 years since I read the book the first time.
Wow. I was just going to ask you, how long did it take you to actually adapt this whole screenplay?
And it needs to interest you for so many years. So you get, because financing takes so long, you get bored of your own stories after a while. So that thematically, it needs to be quite complex and that's the beauty of cinema. You can, it's a completely different approach to TV. I also do a lot of television work, but there's something about pure cinema and cinema that's so important for me. It's about how you look at the themes and making it more complex and something that an audience can watch and rewatch again. But also the cinematic landscape is so important for me whenever I undertake a project. The landscape really has to speak to what the protagonist's journey is. I knew it would make an impeccable, beautiful backdrop. I'm in love with the 1930s as a period, also in terms of costumes and set design. So that was also one of my favorite eras. I just love that time, but also nice as a location. It's such a beautiful backdrop. I love creating films for cinema, and that's my biggest passion. And I knew that I could create something for the big screen with this project. And you know, it's such a sad thing with COVID what's happening, but that's my greatest passion is cinema, and that's just. This book was just about, as I read it, I could just see it being, you know, big screen cinema, and with sound and everything that you can achieve with a Dalene Matthee novel. You know, transporting an audience with sound and everything. The way she writes this magical forest landscape.
Yeah, I mean the location of the film is so magical and so beautiful, you know, and it kind of, for me, in a way, it's testament to almost the book was translated into numerous languages, as with all the Dalene Matthee's books, but in English it was called Dream Forest. Yeah. And I mean, how did you go about to find this wonderful forest? I mean, did you have to go and scout quite a few places, or were you always thinking Knysna and you knew the forest very well?
I did scout the actual Knysna forest over a period of 3 years, and it was very important because the book speaks about the indigenous forest. It's a big thematic argument that's driven in the book. The forest is almost a metaphor for the people that's being uprooted. At the same time, you've got your indigenous trees there, the kalanderboom and the steenkoot, and all of that's indigenous to Knysna, so it can only be filmed there. And, you know, next to it is the pine plantations that's quietly overtaking this beautiful indigenous forest. So it couldn't be filmed anywhere else. But the biggest struggle with Knysna is, over the years, these trees have been cut down. There's Afrikaans word called ingin. So all these big kalanders have been cut down over the years. So we really struggled to find the big trees. The big yellow words, I think, is the English name, kalanderboom. Yeah. So in the area that we were shooting, I scouted for days. I walked all the forest routes. I couldn't find the big yellowwood trees anymore. There were about 3-4 in that space. So the one that we found, it's some of the last ones in that area, which is so sad.
Wow. And I mean, I'm just thinking, it must have been quite hard for you then to move your talent. I mean, you've got such a wonderful talented cast and crew, and probably from some of the best crews that you worked with at the time. I mean, it must have been quite a struggle to get them in and out of the forest every day. Or did you just set up camp there and started to just film on the location and let them all stay around the area?
So I think a big thing for the audience, what I did when I read it, I want to say, when you go to Deep Valley, if you ever go to South Africa again in Knysna Forest, there are beautiful tree forest camps that you can stay in the forest in, which is wonderful. I stayed there, and it gives you a true experience of it. But we couldn't. We stayed in town. It was a 30-minute travel each day. It was winter time as well, because we wanted to film in winter to really get that magical, mythical feeling in the film. And it was a 30-minute drive in, and then we would walk down these dark forest roads. I would just see it. We wouldn't have cell phone reception there as well. I just see the crew with their cell phone lights flashing, trying to find their route in between these dark, muddy roads. We had donkeys that needed to be in set, and you know, these furious 1930s cars, and they got stuck in the mud. They had to be walked in from a little village close by. So it was very challenging.
I can imagine,
yeah. You know, the fact that you are so deep in the forest, you're disconnected from with cell phone reception and everyone else in the outside world. I couldn't speak to my family. You know, you get out there so late at night. But it gave the crew a very connected feeling to one another, and also to nature, because that was what we were used to for 40 years. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's really what comes across in the film, and I think that's one of the strong themes that resonates in the film, about this young girl that's struggling, living in the forest, in this kind of a impoverished white community, then having to move out of the forest and to be living in the town. I know where the romance came from, because you got married in that same year. But I mean, what are the real true strong themes that really stood out for you also when you were thinking about, once you've adapted the screenplay and now you're actually in this forest, and you're filming you're filming everything, and you're seeing all of this around you? What stood out to you, especially as a female director and a sort of a female heroine in the book, if we want to call it that?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is the uprootment themes,
yes.
which carries through Carolina's story. And the question that asks, how can you hold on to your own identity when you're uprooted from the place that you that you were brought up in. And this is for the poor white Afrikaners. Can they stay rooted in their identity? Which was very interesting. And the research that I did, that the forest community, whilst they've been depicted, as a very backwards community in some of the stories, it's not the case with all of them. There was a small section of them called the Veldman Spiers. They didn't look after themselves very well, but in essence, this forest community had a very strong sense of identity. They had a big musical culture. Because they could they make their own. They were getting wood out. They were self-employed. They had a strong sense of identity. So it wasn't they were actually neat and well-kept people. There were certain sections that wasn't. What was also wonderful about this community is it was an integrated community. So that it wasn't separation between colored and white and black. You would marry across the board. And what is the saddest thing about the uprootment story there is how the poor white Afrikaner communities got split from each other to build this new Afrikaner identity, which then gave root to apartheid in the end, because it was easier to manipulate them. And this theme about uprootment is also carried through in the stories of the trees, that the trees, if they're uprooted once, they can't as an ecosystem survive anymore. If you have a bunch of pine plantations, they're more susceptible to sickness and fire outbreaks. As we know, Knysna was big fire outbreaks, but that only happened to the pine plantation, not to the indigenous forest. So, and then to Carolina's story as well, when she's uprooted in her own identity and doesn't stand strong for herself, she's more easily manipulated into the beliefs that Johannes is standing for. And then she has to go back to the forest and to find herself. So I think that theme was the strongest for me. And it was such a beautifully thought out approach by Dalene. And then the other side explores the masculine and feminine, and how the masculine and feminine is almost in this tug of war with one another. It's represented through Carolina and her thoughts and beliefs, but also in the bigger stories, about protecting nature and the general feminine ideas, and then in Johannes, and how that's in conflict with each other. And only through love do they battle one another and then find each other and compromise to find a kind of equilibrium. And that's such a beautiful story about how both of them in their stubbornness, find better and stronger love in the end.
Yes, because she was really such a free-spirited girl, and I think he was also trying to find his way. And like you say, his roots were different, and it was quite a very interesting and powerful universal themes if we think about it today. It was really wonderful, and I mean, you just also earlier told us a little bit about, where you're at in the beginning of our conversation before we started today, just about how who knew there was going to be a global pandemic. And at the time, it was just also COVID at the time. It must have had a really huge impact on your life in general now, going, what you're doing at the moment. And how are you going during this period? And what's happened with industry for you in South Africa at large?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly sad. And I spoke about also the reason why we do this is to create big screen cinema. So the film did wonderful. It was in top 3 at the box office. It did really well in South Africa, but so many cinemas has to be closed. One of our big support cinemas, biggest sales that we had, for example, was independent cinemas, which is Paul, and the Wild Coast Theatre. And I've just recently been shooting in Paul, and they're closing down the Paul Independent Cinema, and also the Wild Coast, which is a massive market for us. It's also, I walked past that it's closed down. And in terms of just sales and revenue, it's been a travesty. But just what it's doing to cinema, I think it's going to change the landscape of how we tell stories, which is so sad, because cinema it's 8 years of grafting and passion, and you do something for TV, you do it in a month or 2 months. So it's a different approach. It saddens me so much. And when I see the cinemas closing this side, the independent cinemas, and they've been doing really well pre-COVID.
Yes, definitely. And I think especially for this market, and because it's an Afrikaans language film and it speaks to a very specific community, I know there's quite a big following for it in South Africa.
Yeah.
And, it must have really hit hard for Toorbos specifically. And like you say, because I think most around the world this has happened, and filmmakers are turning to TV to kind of get them through the space. But I know you spend a lot of time developing scripts, and you're always looking into new projects. So I think congratulations on Toorbos, by the way. It's a really wonderful film, and I think our audiences here would really, really love it. And I think just in saying about the film and where we are at the moment, I just wanted to just last but not least close our conversation briefly, and in our own language and for our expats in Afrikaans. Kan jy vir ons 'n bietjie vertel, Renee, waarmee is jy op die oomblik besig? Jy praat van TV-reekse. Wat is dit wat jy op die oomblik doen? And then we'll switch over to English, and then you can maybe tell us a little bit about what you're developing in the form of film going forward.
Ja. In TV-reekse, ek mag nou eintlik nooit daaroor praat nie, maar ek bedoel dit is so algemeen. Ek ken dit ook. Ons het 'n reeks Alles Milan gedoen wat ek dink dit is so lekker. Ons het eintlik ook gemaak vir mense wat ver van die huis af is, soos in Australië en Nieu-Seeland, wat kan terugkyk. En ons het in die eerste seisoen het ons die Suid-Afrikaanse vlaggies oor die hele stel geplaas, het mense 'n bietjie nostalgies raak. Alles Milan is so gewone alledaagse familiereeks wat die Milans se stories volg in die Parel, en dit het ongelooflik goed gedoen op Kyknet. Die eerste seisoen het baie groot kykergetalle getrek, en dit ons nou 'n tweede seisoen wat ons nou aanpak. So skiet dit op die oomblik in die Parel. Ek en my man doen dit, so dit is aan die gang. And then future I've moved on to something completely controversial and very
wow.
It's called Fear, and it's a story about white anxiety in Africa in its thematic so it tackles this family living in the future in South Africa on a farm, and then they have the fear of this prophecy coming to fruition. So it's and it was developed through Mnet, and I was part of the Realness program. It was selected as one of the African projects for that. So it's the script is done. I'm waiting for feedback still on it, but yeah, it's the next one. And also something more. So it's a psychological horror. So
fantastic! It sounds like one of these dystopian, interesting films that we can look forward to maybe in our coming years of our festival. That's wonderful.
Yeah, but it is quite terrifying. I think it hits a few it hits a few controversial, or not controversial, but topics, very topical questions about white identity in the world and where we're at, and how do we define our identity in a changing world that it is today, and especially in Africa.
Yeah, no, I think you've always had, the interesting kind of look into film, and specifically, like you say, themes are very important for you. So I believe our audiences are really going to love Toorbos on the side, and I think they will be able to identify, like you say, with so many themes that you've touched on, and it's a wonderful film. Congratulations once again.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for screening here and showing it to the audiences. It's really wonderful. It's like it warms your heart to know that a larger audience will be seeing it, and I mean that was the goal, always to create something that just creates, reaches more bigger audiences. So yeah, thank you so much for the festival.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for your time today. We know you're quite busy at the moment, and you must have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.